Hello, everyone. It's great to see you here today, and welcome all to the Pari Center's online summer series exploring the life and work of David Bohm. I'm James Barbieri, member of the board of directors here at Pari Center, and I will be here ensuring that everyone's happy and everything runs smoothly. Today, here with me, we also have Judy Art, associate director of the Pari Center, and she will be your host for today. Before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone of the Zoom rules for this session. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone to ensure a better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we can hear background noise, but this is not to silence the participant's voice, it's just to ensure the overall good audio quality. If anyone would like to ask a question or just make a contribution, they can use the raise your hand tool in the chat or just physically raise your hand, and if we spot you, we'll give you voice. We also invite participants to turn on their video camera, as we believe that seeing everyone's faces, everyone's reactions creates a nice, inclusive educational environment. However, if you don't feel comfortable turning on your camera, you're free to keep it off.
Do other people hear background noise? Because I'm hearing a lot of background noise.
Yes, that will be me, and I do apologize already. I'm currently in a cafe because I don't have Wi-Fi at home, so I do apologize. I hope it won't be a disturbance. I will try to keep myself muted as much as possible during the session. One last thing I would like to say for the Zoom rules is that all sessions will be recorded for archival purposes. The recordings will not include the possible breakout rooms, but only the speaker's presentation, the follow-up discussion, and Q&A. The recordings are available to anyone who has purchased a ticket or for a session that someone has paid for but were unable to attend. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our old friend, Dave Schrum. David has a long connection with Peat, David Bohm, and the Pari Center. He received his PhD in quantum theory from Queen's University, Canada, where David was his supervisor. He then spent 2 years in postdoctoral studies with David Bohm at Birkbeck College in London. At Birkbeck, David entered the world of Bohm's creative and subtle philosophical approaches to physics and of his inquiry into the structure of consciousness and what lay beyond. He was also introduced to his professor's interest in the philosopher Krishnamurti, and David continues to engage in these ideas. Today, he will be addressing the topic Beyond the Known Dimension, a journey into David Bohm's Implicate order. Over to you, Dave.
So thank you very much, James, for your warm introduction. To Paul Howard, a big thank you for all you've done to bring David Bohm forward and to honor David Peat's intention to do that. And to the Pari Center for hosting this. To the directors, Shantina, Hodelia, and Julie, and Maureen and Eleanor, and particularly Eleanor, I would like to say. I think none of us have any idea of the amount of work that Eleanor is doing behind the scenes to make this the event that it is, to pull it all together, keep it running smoothly. So, and thank you all for coming. So, today, we'll go into David Bohm's Implicate order. Our approach will not be scholarly. Rather, I'd like to discover a feeling to see if we can bring out a sense of the implicate within us. And so this will all be built on and around David Bohm's work, but I'll feel free to bring in other voices as we go along. So what we'll do is fairly simple. First, we'll look at matter. We'll look at the implicate order in its material dimension. Then we'll look at mind. We'll look at the implicate order in its mental dimension, or maybe more accurately, its psychological and spiritual dimension. And finally, we'll enter the journey with David Bohm into his approach to this and the question of how we might open it in our own lives and in society as a whole. So that's where we're going. Now, pick up a heavy sheet of paper here. So just to see how this works, first slide, James, please.
We have Julie.
Yes, I will be sharing your slide. Voila. So
Okay.
you just give a sign and I will go to the next slide.
Okay, so instead I'd like you now to thumbnail the slide and go back to speaker view. Whoops. Yeah, just go back to speaker view.
Speaker view?
Oh, well, me, rather than the slide.
Okay.
What word shall we use?
It's perfect.
Yeah, okay. So, what is the implicate order? Well, the implicate order is David Bohm's vision of the universe as one indivisible whole. Mind and matter, consciousness and the cosmos are inseparable, but they emerge from a common source, a vast, unmanifested underlying field, which is the origin of all that is. So this deep ground of unity, Bohm called the implicate order. Next image, please. So the word implicate comes from the Latin, implicare, to fold in, to enfold. Thus the implicate is folded in and out of sight and is not manifested. In Bohm's metaphysics, the implicate is a truly immense hidden realm from which all things arise and into which they re-enfold. What arises from the implicate, he terms the explicate order. Explicate comes from the Latin explicare, to fold out, to unfold. The explicate is folded out. It is unfolded and spread out to view. The explicate is our manifested reality. So everything that's real for us, that's apparent, that's manifested, is the explicate. Also what we measure by measuring devices, observe, radio telescopes, whatever, and then the microcosm, the way we observe elementary particles. So all of that is the explicate order, it's the outward order. So we have implication and explication. So thus we have a cycle of unfolding and enfolding. The implicate emerges from, the explicate emerges from the implicate to become substance. Then it re-enfolds to merge with the implicate, once again disappearing from the manifested world. So we have creation and dissolution, explication and implication following one another. And this is happening at the microcosmic scale. We don't have things flashing in and out of view ordinarily in their daily life. We're talking at the level of elementary particles, which of course is the basis of the whole material order. So to help make clearer to us what he means by the implicate and the explicate in the quantum world, Bohm offers a metaphor for an elementary particle that is moving through space. He uses the ink drop demonstration to model the movement and the very existence of a particle through a process of unfolding and enfolding. Now, we've looked at this before. We're going to look at it again. We'll just give it a little bit more attention this time. So we'll look at this example now. Next image, please. So here we have the artist's conception of a stirrer. What we have are two glass cylinders, two concentric glass cylinders. The inner one has a crank. And between the two cylinders, we have a viscous, transparent medium like glycerin. So the transparent viscous medium, if we put a drop of ink into it, go away for 5 minutes and come back, that drop of ink will still be sitting in the same spot. It won't be like putting a drop of ink in a glass of water where immediately it disperses. So this is a non-dispersive medium. And so if we look at the top view, the first one on top where we have one dot, we've put in an ink drop. After that, we turn the crank for a bit and we can see it's kind of stretching out to a thin line. And after that, we've continued to turn the crank. It's pretty much gone from sight. Maybe there'll be a little bit of a gray blur, but that's all that remains. The ink drop is very much enfolded in the medium. Next slide, please. So here we have a succession of ink drops being placed in. I've shown them all on one slide, but you can imagine, first of all, taking the top ink drop, winding it in till it's out of sight, then the next one till it's out of sight, and the next and so on, winding each in till it's out of sight. Now, if we very rapidly turn the crank back, what we see is effectively a particle moving from the inside to the outside, going along an arc path, because each one comes up in turn and then disappears. It explicates and then re-implicates. It unfolds and enfolds, and it appears like a continuous moving particle. Yeah. So let me see, where am I now? So yes, to help make clearer to us what he means by the implicate and explicate in the quantum world, so Bohm offers this metaphor. Now, so the ink drop model of a quantum particle in motion brings out many features of Bohm's implicate order in this realm. The next image, please. So consider an elementary particle and think of its movement. So we have a particle moving along continuously. Or think of any particle, like a cannonball moving along continuously. When we think of a particle in motion, we think of a local substance that moves continuously through empty space. Now, the ink drop experiment shows us a different way of looking at this. First of all, do we have a local substance? No. What is moving, apparently moving, is something that is enfolded into the whole medium. And in terms of Bohm's elementary particle, it is coming together from the whole of the universe. It's becoming explicate, and it's re-going into the universe. And then it does that again in a different position and so on. So first of all, then, matter is not local. Secondly, it's not even a substance. Rather, it's a process. And then we say, okay, well, here we have this, it's moving continuously. Well, in this view, no, it doesn't actually move at all. It's just unfolding and enfolding. And continuously, no, matter does not continue, it recurs. It keeps on recurring. It's a recurrent process. It's not something that is completely static. This aspect of the implicate order explains why in quantum theory, every particle has associated with it a frequency. So then it's moving through empty space. Well, we can see that space is not empty, it's full. It's full of all the particles that are moving about, only they're there implicitly, not explicitly. And finally, it's not only the particles that are in this so-called empty space, but it's the spaces between them. So we have then that space and matter are not distinct now. They're different expressions of one unitary field. So, I mean, this is really, if you think about this ink drop experiment or model, it's really quite amazing little exposition of an entirely different way of thinking about matter. Now, Bohm wants us to see that his vision goes further than this. The way the ink drop is implicated is just a rather simple winding in. And so Bohm brings out yet more subtle dimensions of the implicate order with a further metaphor, the hologram. Next slide, please. So here we have an image, again, an artist's conception of a happy horticulturalist. So Bohm says, what we're going to do is we're going to use the negative from which this photograph was produced to produce another photograph. But we're just going to use part of the negative. We're just going to snip a little bit off, and we're going to project it and get the picture. Next slide. So there we have it. When we just snip off a bit of the negative and keep it and project it, here's what we get. And yes, maybe this is from an antisocial horticulturalist whose heart is where the photograph is. So what about if we do this with a hologram now? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a hologram and we're going to snip off a little corner of it and project the image. Next picture. Well, what do we get? We get the whole picture. It's a little fuzzy now. It's not quite as accurate because we don't have the whole hologram, but any piece that we snip from the hologram will give us the whole picture. So we can see then that this is a very different order. And so take then the ink drop experiment where we have the ink drop wound in. That's one kind of implication, but Bohm says it's much deeper, much more profound than that. It's much more like a hologram where every part enfolds the whole. So we're talking about every part of the universe enfolding the whole. But he's not just talking about a static hologram, he's talking about a space-time hologram. So the whole is not just everywhere, it's every when. So we're looking at something which is really extraordinarily profoundly different view of the universe. You know, he just didn't pull this out of his head. This follows from insights into quantum theory, and we'll go into that a little bit. So with the hologram, Bohm brings a deeper sense of enfoldment than does the ink drop experiment. The ink drop stretches through the whole, but is not embodied so profoundly as the image in the hologram. In the hologram, the whole is in every part. Similarly, in the implicate order, every part is enfolded in every other part. Excuse me. So as Bohm points out, we have a new order of description here. In this new order of description, the primary relationship of things is no longer that they're outside one another. You know, here's one thing, here's another thing. What we mean by that is they're outside one another. In the implicate order, they are interior to one another. Everything is within or inside everything else. In the same way that each of the ink drops becomes within the other ones. So the need for a description of nature that is holistic in this way arises from discoveries in quantum physics that show the universe to be one inseparable whole. Events vastly separated, not joined by any signal, are still connected. Distant parts are in direct and immediate relationship through an underlying order that spreads throughout all of space. Thus, the implicate order is embodied in what we call emptiness, the vacuum, or free space. So space we usually think of as a void, as entirely without content. I guess actually we can come back to, we can leave the little people and come back to the speaker view. So space we usually think of as a void, as entirely without content. But the space of the implicate order is a plenum. It's entirely full. Now this plenum holds a vast content. It holds immensely more than the matter of the entire universe. Am I just wondering, am I on screen? Anyhow, so this plenum holds a vast content, immensely more than the matter of the entire universe. It is a realm outside of space and time in which every part of the universe is in immediate contact with every other part. So this is highly ordered, this plenum, so that light and matter pass through it undisturbed, so that it is unseen. Now we have a similar situation in low temperature solid state physics, where electrons pass through a perfect crystal of dense matter as if nothing were present. And like the implicate order, supercooled systems display highly ordered non-local states. Fluids flow and currents pass through substances both freely without resistance. The implicate order is a realm of immense ongoing flux at the quantum level. What we call particles, as we've seen, are not substances, they're processes. They're not continuous, as we have seen, but they emerge and dissolve recurrently. They explicate and implicate. Now, metaphorically, we may think of the implicate order as a broad, deep ocean. The implicate order, the explicate order, our entire universe is but a small ripple on this ocean's surface. I mean, incredibly small. So by comparison to our universe, the implicate is vast beyond imagination. And by Bohm's calculations, a single cubic center of emptiness, as I mentioned in the film, contains much more matter energy equivalent than our entire universe. Now, when I said much more, that's really an understatement. It contains 10 to the 40th universes of matter energy. That's a 1 with 40 zeros after it. Take that, 1 with 40 zeros, and multiply it by the mass energy content of the universe. And in this little space here, that's how much there is of the implicate order. So the depthless sea of the implicate order as a whole contains the equivalent, this is within our whole visible universe, the equivalent of 10 to the 126 universes, which is a 1 with 126 zeros after it. Now, are we thinking that Bohm has maybe gone a little bit mad with these numbers? But no, what he's doing is he's following physics where it leads. People who are trying to unify the fundamental forces of nature, some of which have been unified, but also put them all out individually: electricity, magnetism, the weak force responsible for radioactivity, the strong force that holds the atomic nuclei together, and gravity. People are trying to unify all those, and it's clear to them all that to do this, they have to go down to a very fine level called the Planck level. Sorry, I just had a pop-up from somewhere. So they go down to to a very fine level, the Planck level, and that is the level basically at which gravity together with quantum theory start to tear apart the basic fabric of space-time, and we've left behind every descriptive order that we can construe. But that is really the level at which this vast unification has to occur. So now all that Bohm has done is sum in a very straightforward way all the energy levels of the plenum down to there. And this is how he comes up with this vastness that must be contained in it. Now, where did this idea of a plenum come from? Well, this is not new either. The famous British physicist Paul Dirac brought this in when he brought in his famous Dirac's equation in order to explain the matter-antimatter paradox. In order to, well, he actually predicted antimatter, which was very shortly thereafter found to exist. And he used a plenum called the Dirac sea. Now, people have found other ways to calculate this in more recent times, but they're all mathematically equivalent to the Dirac sea, to a plenum. So Bohm is using really standard stuff, but he's taking it seriously. You know, he's taking it to where does this lead? So this implicate order, the entirety of its order, its holism and its flux of unfolding and enfolding, Bohm called the holo movement. Comes from holos Greek, which simply means whole, movement of the whole. And he characterized the holo movement by the expression undivided wholeness in flowing movement. Undivided wholeness in flowing movement. And so that's how this is characterized. Now, I guess I didn't mention at first. We'll do the implicate order. I'll introduce it now. First in matter, then in mind, and then what we'll do lastly is we will ask ourselves what it is to step into that and take Bohm's journey into the implicate within. So there's matter. We're going to shift now, segue a bit. So I'd like to shift now from the implicate in matter toward the implicate in mind. And a simple example brings together both the material and the mental perceptual dimensions. What we're going to look at is the flow of water in a curbside gutter following a rainfall. Image, please. So, I mean, we're all quite familiar with that, you know, and I mean, if we've ever looked at it, we've seen obviously there's a cross-hatched pattern of the water as it flows along. And what the image doesn't show is that cross-hatched pattern is not completely stable. It has a little random, you know, tremble to it, a little random flickering. And I'd just like to note that also, the random tremble in the pattern makes me think of random fluctuations in the quantum theory. So these cross-hatched waves, they really correspond to bow waves of a ship. We imagine a ship cutting through water. I don't know if I'm on screen or not, but imagine a ship cutting through water. We have waves coming off each side, a series of waves. These are bow waves. Now imagine two ships side by side and waves coming off from either one. And then these will form a cross-hatched pattern. Two ships go along, they both produce waves, and these interfere with one another, and we'll have the cross-hatched pattern. We really have the same thing in the gutter, except that rather than obstacles moving relative to the water, we have the water moving relative to irregularities or obstacles in the side. Now, so I'd like to recount a little story. I've always been very fond of observing water, watching waves break, standing on a hillside above a lake, seeing waves go in, come out, their interference patterns, so on, and looking at curbside flows. Well, one January, deep in our Sudbury winter here with 3 feet of snow on the ground, we had a freak lightning storm with rain. And this was at night. And so just wonderful flows of water along the curbside. So after the storm, I thought I'd go out and have a look in the dark. And perfect viewing because the water was black, the sodium vapor lamps reflecting off it were gold, and perfect black and fold patterns, the crosshatch pattern, and this little random tremble on it, this little random flicker. Now, I recall then, looking at that, and I think I noticed a little piece of flotsam or a bit of ice floating along. My eye followed that, and I thought I saw something, thought everything changed. And so I tried again. And yes, indeed, there's a whole different order. And after I practiced, you can just sweep your eye along. It's really only a fraction of a second to follow the pattern before you have to go back again. And I could see and realized that there's a whole other pattern there, a whole other order that was obscured by my way of looking at it. Now, can I have one slide, please? I should have shown this before. That's a photograph on your left side of water. And on the right side is sort of a schematic of how the bow waves go and how they make the crosshatch pattern. So next slide. So as the eye sweeps along, it sees this whole different pattern, which is nothing like a crosshatch pattern at all. It's like cartoonists or kids' versions of a cloud with scalloped edges. And these forms slide down. Now, these waves, physicists call roll waves. They roll along the surface of the water. So they're well known to physics too. So what I'd like to bring out in this example is a kind of sense of an implicate order or implicit order that's expressed and exposed in a slightly different way. For decades, I glanced at curbside water flows and seen a crosshatch pattern. And then I chanced to look at it differently. And there's a whole other order there, a whole hidden order. Now, let's go back to our crosshatch pattern. Remember, it's not perfect, it has a little tremble, a little random flicker. Well, what is that? That is a whole other order passing through, but not seen. The other thing that I'd like to bring out is, how was the new order discovered? So the new order was discovered by appropriate scanning, by scanning it properly. With appropriate scanning, we can discover new orders. So this is with the senses. So all this parallels how David Bohm suggests that we become aware of the implicate within us. Bohm indicates, inwardly, we become sensitive to the flickers and subtle movements that pass through us, swiftly, liminally, usually unnoticed. Relevant to this, Bohm has pointed out, for the eye to see something, it must scan it properly, as with our example here. What the eye doesn't correctly scan, it doesn't see. For us, it doesn't exist. For example, if the eye doesn't properly scan a bear peering through a thicket, we don't notice the bear. Similarly, within ourselves, everything which the mind does not scan properly for us will not exist. So discovering appropriate scanning inwardly is an act of meditation, the discovery of new orders within in this way. Bohm suggests that in this way, and I'll quote him, the mind is able to scan its overall content, including not only knowledge, but also what is revealed in the sensitive response of awareness. And he doesn't tell us what that is. He leaves that open to us to discover. So we have the same factors here with Bohm as we have in the discovery of the roll waves. Within the explicate order of mind, there will be hints and intimations in the background if we become sensitive to these. With attention and appropriate scanning, hints of things not explicate occur. With appropriate attention to subtle feelings, the implicate may unfold to become explicate. So this is all rather subtle, and let's come back to something which is a little bit more direct for us. We may also become of the implicate order within us in less subtle, simpler ways. We'll move in this direction to help build a feeling for what David means by the implicate order within. So, what is the implicate order in its mental dimension? So we've kind of shifted into that. We're going to go into that now. Let's begin with a few examples. First, consider listening to music. This is, I think, pretty straightforward. Music is about movement. It's about unfolding and enfolding. Phrases unfold into the resonance of other phrases, and in turn, the resonances fold into further phrases. Themes unfold from and enfold into other themes. In fact, each individual note is enfolded in the reverberations of previous notes. All this gives a sense of flowing movement. Suppose now that one note is played briefly, followed by silence, and then another note followed by silence, and so on. Then notes do not enfold into the echoes of others, but are solitary sounds. These carry no sense of flow, wholeness, and movement, although they remain the same notes that provided the music before it. So we can see here how enfoldment and unfolding generate a sense of wholeness, context, and movement. Now, more interesting, I feel, is Bohm's understanding that the implicate order is our primary ground of perception. The implicate order is our primary ground of reception, of perception. So David was deeply interested in this pre-verbal primitive level. He would speak of Piaget's studies of the construction of reality in the child. That's the title of a book, The Construction of Reality in the Child. Of the infant before concepts of space, time, and causality had been developed. Now, Bohm indicates that this implicate level in ourselves remains subtly active in us as adults, and that it underpins the explicate surface order that we have built upon it. In this view, the outward explicate expression arises from a continuing inner flow of subliminal prehensions, tendencies, urges. So these subtle impulses are channeled into our established patterns of thinking, feeling, reacting. So they come to conform to the way we do business. Thus, what arises from this stream is shaped by habitual processes as it rises to the surface, where it plays out explicitly. Now, Bohm felt that this underlying implicate realm is the key, to perceptions that are not limited by our conscious space-time frame of reference. Now, what I find most interesting here is the perception that in all our moments, the implicate and the explicate are co-present, moving in relation to one another. So this indicates the fascinating possibility of awareness of these aspects as they move together within us. It would seem that a different sort of scanning by the mind would be needed. This would bring with it, clearly, a new sense of reality. Now, as the prime feature of the implicate order in the mind is movement, it makes sense that an appreciation of our inner realm as process might be an open door. In fact, Bohm takes this approach. He points to what he calls participatory understanding. We'll explore this later in the talk. But a further example, because we're trying to build ourselves a sense of the implicate. So a further view, one that is not from Bohm, but that I find helpful in bringing a concrete sense to the implicate and explicate within us. It comes from looking at the different kinds of activity in the two hemispheres of the brain. Maybe we could go back to speaker view. We've probably seen that picture long enough. So each of these hemispheres specializes in a different sort of processing. The explicate, we will see, is largely an expression of left brain activity, while the implicate is an expression of the right. The left hemisphere tends to express itself explicitly through words, concepts, and symbols. That's pretty much what we're doing now. By contrast, the right tends to intimate its perceptions as context, feeling, mood, and movement. We do have that in the background, although we might not be noting it. So the left is more about content. It's more about what I think and feel, whereas the right is more about process. It's immersed in process, and it's about how I think and feel. The left hemisphere houses the centers of speech production, Broca's area, and language interpretation, Wernicke's area. Thus, this hemisphere is largely responsible for the highly explicit or explicate activities of reasoning, analyzing, and sequential linear thought. It is the source of conceptual understanding of what David Bohm termed literal thought. Literal thought. So the left works in time from past knowledge, projecting a future. It tends to keep active, judging, assessing, planning, problem solving. You know, all the stuff that goes on in our internal monologue. The right hemisphere, by contrast, meets life in the present in a non-directed way. It is open to embrace a sense of the whole, how this moment feels, and it provides context and a sense of movement. The right brain operates through awareness that is not committed to any direction. Thus, it is available to meet what arises in the moment. It picks up implications and inferences and embodies senses of wholeness and flow. It learns through what Bohm calls participatory understanding. Participatory understanding. These two hemispheres work together. When they operate in harmony, the free perceptive movement of the right brain is complemented by the defined technical skills and knowledge of the left, so that the brain may act intelligently as a perceptive and creative whole. However, as Bohm points out, we tend to fail to achieve such creative harmony. For us in our society, thought and knowledge-based processes that are not coherent tend to dominate our consciousness. Albert Einstein made a similar point, and I must remember the quote. It's a favorite of mine. Einstein said, he used different terminology from Bohm. Instead of literal mind, he said rational mind, and instead of participatory, he spoke of intuitive. So Einstein. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. I find this a very powerful statement. And so this is really the challenge that David Bohm dedicated most of his later years to meeting, to try and take individuals and societies beyond the point where we have forgotten the sacred gift and we're honoring the servant, which is valuable, but it's in the wrong place. So in particular, David developed and offered an approach to the transformation of individuals and the culture through what has become called Bohmian dialogue. We will look into this later. So going on to get a feeling for this implicate order, I find it helpful to picture the brain as it receives millions of signals every 40th of a second. I say every 40th of a second because that's the refresh time for the brain. So every 40th of a second, 25 milliseconds, the brain refreshes cyclically before it is flooded once again with a further influx of information. Question: how does the brain handle this acid trip of stimulation? Well, it turns out that each of the hemispheres has its own strategy. Now, we're going to talk about this quite informally, metaphorically. The point is to give a feeling. So the left brain, the side primarily responsible for language and reasoning, looks into the flux and pulls out what it deems as important. It abstracts that, pulls out, so this is cutting it down to manageable proportions. It takes this material, whittles it down to manageable proportions, and then it packages it and labels it. So the left hemisphere handles this now limited content of packages by sorting, reasoning, etc. So that's the simple picture. Now Bohm, explores this whole process at depth, going into how the mind deals with the vastness of sensory experience through a process of abstraction, idealization, conceptualization, and reification. And he goes into that at length. We don't have time, but abstraction, firstly, the brain is abstracting, pulling out from this vast sensory input what it sees as important. And then idealization is going to take that and frame it in the patterns and concepts that it already has, that it already knows. Otherwise, it won't feel it understands anything. And package those together in concepts, conceptualization. And lastly, it puts a flag or label on it through reification. It says, this is real. And that's important because if I see a bus coming at me and I'm crossing the street, it's important that I distinguish between whether this is a dream, a hallucination, something I'm imagining, or the real thing. So reification is important. If it's a real thing, I better hop quickly. So now Bohm, and we could really go into that at depth, but well, there's just so many things, and we're just touching on the high points of all of them. So Bohm turns this Bohm terms this conceptual or literal understanding. We've already said that. And it's a highly reductionist process, as we can see. It just keeps on whittling things down into smaller packages and then relating these small packages. Now, by contrast, the strategy of the right brain is entirely different. And we're speaking metaphorically now, again, so that we get a feel for this. The right brain does not eliminate most of the informational flux. It retains it. Rather, it plunges into the surging sea of information of its entirety. It swims with this deluge and is of it. So the right brain knows what is by being what is, by embodying it fully. It participates in the moment and the movement of the moment without resistance. Without resistance is key. Now, when Shantina was speaking, he gave us a story, which I think is maybe, a Taoist story, which is worth repeating. And this is of Confucius coming to a waterfall with a churning pool at the base. And there's a man in this churning pool, and Confucius is sure he's going to drown. But he seems to easily make it to shore. And Confucius asks him how he does this. And of course, it's this Taoist story. Our hero is a Taoist monk. And the monk says, very simply, when the water goes down, I go down. When the water comes up, I come up. So this is a story of moving, participating fully, of moving with something fully without resistance. So as a final example of trying to give us a sense of, or giving us a sense, I hope, of mind in its implicate participatory direction, there is a brief but fascinating writing by Albert Einstein, which people who have attended Pari talks may have heard me mention before. This is a brief writing in which Einstein talks about his own creative process. So, Albert Einstein was asked by French mathematician Jacques Hadamard to describe his mental processes in his research. And so this is a brief report of that. It's quite brief. And what I'll do is I'll just read some snippets from it, because I think we tend to think of the great mind of Einstein as someone who took a lot of information, figured things out logically, and so on. But no, he used participatory consciousness. He used embodied feeling and so on. So here's Einstein about his creative process. The words or the language as they are written or spoken do not seem to play any role in my mechanism of thought. This is in his primary research. He says, the entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs or more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. So we see here is a person who is not very much in the explicate order. He's not in the left brain. He's understood participatory thought and implication quite deeply. He goes on, and I'm jumping just bits and pieces here. From a psychological viewpoint, this combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought. Before there is any connection with logical construction. So this all happens before there's any connection with reasoning logic in words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others. So he's at a level of process here, which is clearly not explicate. I mean, it can't even be communicated yet. So the above mentioned elements are, in my case, a visual and some of muscular type. This is very much right brain activity. Conventional signs or words or other signs have to be sought for laboriously, only in a secondary stage. So it's still difficult, you know, to bring things into the explicate, into the outward order. There's work here. So we can see then that the territory in which he's working is far from what we would call rational mind. Now, rational mind is important because we must bring it out into that order. We must bring things out into that order and structure them in a clear, explicate way in the end. But the primary ground of his creativity is other than that. And last little snippet I'll take is, in a stage when words intervene at all, they are, in my case, purely auditive, but they interfere only in a secondary stage. So, interesting choice of words. When words intervene and when words interfere, it happens only in a secondary stage. So again, we see the emphasis on the pre-verbal, non-explicate order. And we can think then of Piaget's pre-verbal mind. So we've looked at some examples to find a feeling for the implicate in mind. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move further, and we're going to have a look at David Bohm's overarching perception of mind. Here we will find an immensity that parallels the vastness of the implicate in physics. So, we have looked at examples of mind in its implicate dimension to give us a feeling for it. I'd like to shift now from these particulars to David Bohm's overarching view of mind, similarly to what we've done with matter. And as with matter, we will see the implicate ground of the explicate, the implicate ground of the explicate as vast beyond imagination. To help picture this territory, we'll use an image that I've used before in Pari. We'll use an image that became common following Freud's popularization of unconscious mind. The iceberg, we're all familiar with that. Conscious mind above water exposed, the unconscious submerged and invisible. So we'll begin with this simple picture, and we're going to broaden it as we go along. We'll use the images that we develop to help give a feeling for the terminology that we'll be using. So that's what these images are, their purpose is, to give us a feeling for the terminology. We're not saying what is, we're not icebergs, And the iceberg analogy, any analogy or any words or any description that you make of mind, any explicate form is going to be inadequate. It's just not going to be possible to cut it. It's really only possible to begin to understand mind properly through participation in it, I would say. So David Bohm saw the need of a further realm of mind as well. Oh yeah, let's show the old Freudian iceberg. There it is. Here we have the explicate part, our surface consciousness, the conscious mind, glowing pink in the sunset. And I don't know about the artist's conception of the color of the rest, but so we have Bohm and Freud, and basically what we're saying is that they both perceived the same issues, way of looking at things. We have conscious, surface, mind, and we'll see over on the far right that is explicate, explicit, exposed. And the submerged portion, Freud called the unconscious, in which he included the pre-conscious mind, sometimes called subconscious. And that Bohm speaks of in a different way, by quite a mouthful, the tacit infrastructure of consciousness. That's the part that's out of sight. But the part that's out of sight, we can see, is the foundation of the rest. And it's what the rest is, what the surface is built on. This implicate order, which is under the surface. And it's not only the foundation, but it's really the source out of which the explicate order unfolds, emerges. So why did Bohm go to the trouble of this complex expression? Well, Bohm paid a great deal of attention to the etymology of words, and conscious is conscious, with knowing or with knowledge. So the conscious mind is with knowledge. Now, Bohm says, however, the underwater part of the iceberg is knowledge too. It's just knowledge that's not exposed. It's also a structured form. And so he didn't want to call it the unconscious conscious, and so he therefore called it the tacit or silent infrastructure of consciousness. Now, we'll notice one thing also. So the bottom of the iceberg is in the implicate. We'll notice that the arrow goes down. So David Bohm saw the need of a further realm of mind as well, a subtler fluid realm. That's why the implicate arrow is going down. Conscious mind and the tacit infrastructure of the psyche are fixed forms, built from content crystallized in memory. So we have the conscious mind and the unconscious or tacit infrastructure. They're both crystallized. They're both defined forms, just like the crystal forms of the ice above and below. So these conscious mind and the tacit infrastructure of the psyche are fixed forms. They're built from content crystallized in memory. So these represent mechanical forms and processes. They work through cause and effect, like machinery. But where is awareness, perception, intelligence, and creativity? Excuse me. The play of mind beyond the restrictive movement of mechanism, this field of free unencumbered play, must be represented as well. And this field, David Bohm called the holo movement. So we see then, we've heard about the holo movement in physics, in matter. And so the understanding then is that at a deep enough level, mind, what we call matter, begin to merge in their nature. So this must be represented as well. So Bohm is now taking seriously not only the iceberg above water and below, but he's taking the whole fluid medium of the sea as a further dimension of mind, which is why the implicate arrow goes down. It includes not only the tacit infrastructure of consciousness, but the vast fluid holo movement. So Bohm is not the only one who thought about these things. Carl Jung, who also plumbed mind deeply, was aware also of a ground beyond mechanically programmed mind. This subtle dynamic field he named the pleroma, and we'll shift to the next image. So there's a lot on this, but let's just look, and we see Bohm's holo movement, the vast fluid medium, is more or less equivalent to Jung's pleroma. So Jung and Bohm both perceived the necessity of a field beyond crystallized structure, active outside the mechanical order, thus not imaginable by the mechanisms of mind. Such a field is needed to account for fluid movements of mind that originate beyond the rational order. Think of awareness, insight, creativity. Now, it is important to note at this point that we're not saying Bohm's and Jung's understandings are identical. Rather, they saw the need for similar descriptive categories. We'll note further parallels in perception as well. So to give us, I see the time is flying, oh my gosh. To give us a deeper sense of this field that Bohm and Jung perceived and defined similarly, I just quickly read a few quotes from each. The holo movement and Jung's pleroma are both characterized as the ground of all and subtle beyond measure and description. So, first of all, the ground of all, here's what Jung has to say. So that is how we should understand the pleroma, the fullness of which is the origin of the existence of the world, where everything is contained, but in potentia, as a possibility. Anything can come out of it. It's like Bohm, it's like the ink drop. Everything is contained in potentia as a possibility. Anything can come out of it. For Bohm, the implicate order has its ground in the holo movement, which, as we have seen, is vast, rich, in a state of unending flux and enfoldment and unfoldment. So our general approach has brought together questions of the nature of the cosmos, of matter in general, and of consciousness. All of these have been considered to be projections of a common ground. In other words, explications of a common implicate order. This we may call the ground of all that is. So, and they're both subtle beyond description and measure. So Bohm, in its totality, the whole of movement is not limited in any specifiable way. It is not required to conform to any particular order or to be bounded by any particular measure. Thus, the whole of movement is undefinable and immeasurable. And Jung quickly, it's quite fruitless to think about the pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and infinite possess no qualities. The eternal and infinite possess no qualities. Now, these are actually different ways of saying the same thing, but we really don't have a lot of time, I see. Gosh.
Dave, don't worry. You can. There's no rush. Take your time.
Okay, I can read slowly. That's good because I'm not highly skilled at reading quickly. So on our image, we have a further feature that Bohm and Jung have in common. It is represented by an ice flow of melded fragments rather than an iceberg. This shows the deeper levels of the infrastructure of consciousness as common to us all. Jung criticized what he called Freud's purely personal approach to the mind. He said, there is an impersonal stratum in our psyche. We are not of today or yesterday. We are of an immense age. That through time and culture and many other things, this is all accumulated. Bohm termed this stratum the collective unconscious, you can see, pointing to near where it says general. We'll get around to that. Bohm also appreciated an infrastructure of consciousness that is common to us all. And as we've seen, he named it the tacit infrastructure of consciousness. It's more or less the same thing that we're talking about. So at this level, if we penetrate ourselves, our mind to this level, where we're all involved in the same fundamental general processes, we find that we are all more or less the same. We just play the deep things out in our own personal idiosyncratic manner. So here David pointed out that our primary relationship at this level, if we reach it, when we reach it, is again that we are interior to one another. We are really the same movement. At this level, if I find out something about me, I found out something about you, and vice versa. So the sage Krishnamurti, with whom Bohm dialogued over 25 years, expressed our common consciousness this way. Krishnamurti said, our consciousness is not actually yours or mine. It is the consciousness of humanity evolved, grown, accumulated through many, many centuries. So we see deep parallels here in these perspectives. Bohm, Jung, and Krishnamurti. Eckhart Tolle says the same thing. Again, this would be something we could spend a great deal of time going into. So anyhow, these deep parallels point to an implicate common ground or movement from which each of our individual consciousnesses unfold consciousnesses. So next in our image, the many iceberg ice flow tips above the water represent individual consciousness. That's me as an individual, you as an individual, right? And we're all sharing the same collective tacit infrastructure. And notice that each individual consciousness has its own individual neck just below water, which means that we have a personal unconsciousness or unconscious or tacit infrastructure, but really more deeply, at a deeper level, we all belong to the general. They all merge. So finally, the most prominent feature in the diagram, which I haven't mentioned, are Bohm's broad categories for different dimensions of consciousness: the particular, the general, and the universal. Here is more of Bohm's terminology. And there are many ways he talks about these things, not just way. These are broad generic terms for primary dimensions of our mind. The particular is the individual dimension of oneself, our own experiences, attitudes, interests, ways of doing things, and so on. Everything that is personal. The general is the non-personal dimension of ourselves. That's what is common to us. And while the particular tends to be represented by contents of consciousness, for example, the particular fear of, say, darkness, the general is the process itself, in this case, fear. The general being common to us all, it consists of general programs of consciousness, such as identification, distinction, fear, desire, attraction, aversion, etc. We each play out these programs in our own particular personal way. The general programs are both generic and generative. They are the generic template for, say, anger, and the generative impulse that generates the emergence of anger in surface consciousness. And beyond all this, that vast sea, the universal dimension is a subtler matter. And we'll consider it later when we go into Bohm's participatory understanding. Oh my gosh, the time. So it is through participatory understanding that we may delve into the implicate order in its general and universal dimensions. I'm wondering if I can cut back here. I won't go on about these distinctions again, the general and the particular, and the universal.
Please don't cut back. Please don't cut back. We'll cut back questions.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
Dave, really, don't worry about time. It's all good.
okay. I'm talking more slowly than when I did it myself. I would like to close this section with an appreciation of the immensity of the view that Bohm is offering. First, the general dimension of the mind is vast. It is a movement, a flow spread out to encompass all humanity, not only now, but through deep time. It is unlimited in a participatory sense, without limit or boundary. And then the universal dimension is unlimited in a different sense. It is what Bohm terms a qualitative infinity. Now, note by contradistinction, the personal particular individual space in which most of us tend to largely live is limited. We're cultured to this norm. We've developed, period. Okay, let's move on. So we've developed a sense of the implicate order in its mental dimension. It shows itself simply as pre-verbal understanding. Also, it intimates vast territories and potentials. We'll look now at David Bohm's view of the importance and the proper place of this concept, the implicate order. Bohm will speak for himself. He's being interviewed by his friend Rene Weber. Weber is a professor of philosophy, or was, I should say, at Rutgers University. And in their conversation, they have been examining the implicate order, delving into its meaning, its importance. And I'm just going to bring us to the finale and some little snippets from that. So here's Bohm about the implicate order. You see, the point that we have been You see, the point is that we have been talking about something which is a kind of bridge. This whole construction of the implicate order is a kind of bridge. We can put it in ordinary language, as we've done, but its implication leads somewhere beyond. At the same time, however, if you don't cross the bridge and leave it behind, you're always on the bridge. No use being there. Rene Weber. Yes, that's true. You're stuck there. Boom. So the purpose of a bridge is to cross. Or more accurately, we could perhaps think of a pier leading us out into the ocean and enabling us to dive into the depths. So we could say that if we could consider it seriously, aside from its utility in understanding matter, the bridge or pier would help us to loosen our way of considering consciousness so that it doesn't hold so rigidly. I'm going to jump now. Bohm is saying now, from that point of view, you could say that even to linger on the implicate order, that is as a concept, would then make it become part of the same general thing. Rene Weber, you mean it's another thought, it's an obstacle. Bohm, yes, it's like the fellow who stays on the pier and never dives into the depths of the ocean. So Bohm is saying that while the implicate order, as a concept, may help us to better understand matter, its deep importance is something else. The idea of the implicate order implies or intimates a field beyond the manifested order of everyday life. Its purpose as a concept is to act for us as a bridge beyond what we have known into exploration of a profound realm that has always been present. So, what is involved in this? So, in his dialogue with Rene Weber, David Bohm leaves us faced into immensity. We see basically the two infinities of the general and the universal. And he leaves us with the challenge of stepping beyond where we normally walk and of crossing the bridge to which he points. More precisely, as he sharpens his metaphor, our question becomes what it is to step free of the pier, which is the concept of the implicate order, and actually to plunge into the ocean. To answer these questions, we will need to be clear about the difference between two sorts of understanding. The fixed, defined kind of understanding represented by the conceptual pier, and the fluid, free-moving, non-conceptual understanding represented by swimming in a boundless sea. Now, we have touched on these before, David's literal and participatory understanding. Now we'll go into them more carefully in a stepwise manner. So literal understanding is just that, literal. It's understanding in accord with the letter, with the word, with the idea or concept. It is the sort of understanding with which we're familiar. Literally, to understand means to have understood. We've formed a concept which fits into our established framework of thought, and we say, I have understood. If it fits my pattern of thinking and I can do it in an orderly way, I say I've understood. We can see the limitations right there, right? Such understanding is cumulative and is of the past. All that we have understood is an accumulation stored in memory. Participatory understanding, by contrast, is of the present moment. It arises through intimacy with the present, in its feeling, in its movement. It is not conceptual, but is more a felt or embodied sense of the present. Its essence is not stored in memory as an idea or conclusion. It is not cumulative. So we have an understanding which is not cumulative. It is a living, moving presence. In explaining the meaning of participatory understanding, David Bohm points out that the verb to participate has two meanings. Next image, please. Next image. There we go. So participate has two meanings. These are to take part in and to partake of. Thus, in one way, participation is a movement outward, to take part in something. In another, it is a drawing inward or an open reception of that as it flows in. Like the tide going out and the tide coming in, these are aspects of one ongoing movement. A simple example of participatory thought that Bohm gives is our response when listening to music. Our senses move into the harmonies to take part of them, in them. Our feelings open to the inward flood to partake of the movement, the flow, the transitions, themes, and so on. So this example of music appreciation obviously recalls our discussion of the apprehension of music by mind in its implicate dimension. And I think it is apparent that participatory understanding is of the implicate order of mind. Thus, all that we have said previously about the implicate in its mental dimension will apply to participatory understanding. Participatory understanding clearly originates in embodied, right hemisphere-led activity, while literal understanding is directed by the intellectual, rational, verbal processes of the left. As well, we may associate participatory understanding with the pre-verbal movement Piaget studied in the child, which underlies our conceptually developed intellect. So we're just reminding ourselves of the previous examples, which all are actually expressions of participatory understanding. And also, of course, we may identify the participatory mode with the nonverbal play that Einstein used in his research. It is important, too, to bring out not just the differences between literal and participatory thought, but also their complementary nature. At different times, Bohm used different terminology when referring to these. If you start to read Bohm, you'll find it changes his terminology with a lot of things as he goes along. So when exploring creativity, he tended to refer to literal conceptual thought as technique. And he would speak of participation more in terms of awareness and attention. So for a creative process, Bohm would explain, we need them both. We need to bring together both the literal technical thought and participatory awareness/attention. The former, literal technical thought, provides knowledge and develops skillfulness, while the latter, participatory awareness, brings newness through the openness and fluidity of mind participating freely and perceiving freshly. In such creative activity, the mind operates as an harmonious whole, engaging both literal and participatory functions, each in its appropriate place. So in this lies the quality of genius. Now, Bohm does not think of genius as special to the few. Rather, he perceives genius as very much a potential for us all. And you'll see that in most of his writings, when he uses the word genius, he puts it in quotation marks. And he understands very well that this is a territory that belongs to all of us if we enter more into the participatory aspect of our minds. So why then is human society on the whole so incoherent and limited? Clearly, we've been educated and developed in a word and image-based culture. Thus, we tend to be shaped from without by literal thought. Inwardly, we are directed by the contents of our personal thoughts and emotions. Mind based in such fixed forms tends to override or overlay our participatory movement. Society does not culture us to be deeply, subtly open and exploratory. Rather, we are taught patterns. Thus, the brain becomes routinized and operates from established fixed action patterns. I don't know. Okay, it is important to point out at the same time that fixed action patterns are valuable and necessary. The issue is not that they exist, it's that they have become lodged in the mind in a way that brings limitations and incoherence. Fixed action patterns are well known in neurophysiology. They're routinized, stereotypical behaviors such as walking. They're essential to our functioning. Skills become built-in, implicit programs stored in memory. We don't have to learn anew each time how to walk. Such mechanical functions of the body such as this, beyond mechanical functions of the body such as this, our evolutionary history has needed instant, complex reactions to meet situations of sudden danger. Without these emotion-driven fixed action patterns, human beings would not have survived. Neuroscientist and writer Rudolfo Linus points out that emotions of themselves are complex fixed action patterns of this sort. These control not only our scanning patterns, but also our responses. They tend to lock us into a cyclic, limited system. How do we go beyond the fixed action patterns? Oh my gosh, we have many pages of going beyond them, I'm afraid. So, what are we going to do here? This is not the way it went when I read it. Well, one vehicle that Bohm offers is dialogue. And I think we can find out about dialogue by reading David Bohm on dialogue. I won't say what it is.
That's the best part.
You said that's the best part, eh?
It's the most important.
Maybe we can give it a break. Can we do a cross check with the Pari Center if we can go an extra half hour or something so that he can breathe a little, and let's just check in with people.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, personally, I can't, but I don't know. Judy, can you go for an extra half hour?
I could listen to David for a long time. So let's say, David, why don't you end, and then we offer you do everything that you prepared, and even with Caroline coming in, and then just the moment we hit the top of the hour and people need to leave, then just feel free to go, and we'll send you the recording so you will see the conversation afterwards. Okay?
Okay. I'm sorry about this. This is not the way it went when I read it.
It's okay. It's because it's so interesting. So take your time.
Okay. So quickly a bit about dialogue then. So one vehicle that David Bohm offers is dialogue. In Bohm dialogue, a group meets together in an open forum to talk freely. The key features of dialogue at its simplest are just two: listening and suspension. Ordinarily, when people come together to share their thoughts, what is important to most is to speak and be heard. In dialogue, by contrast, the focus is on listening. It is in deep listening that the miracle of dialogue can occur. To listen deeply is an extraordinary art. We cannot properly listen if we do so through the screen of our own opinions and through our judgment of others and their opinions. We need to suspend these processes. This suspension is the foundation of Bohm dialogue. To suspend in David Bohm's sense is to hold out before oneself, as we're suspending something. You suspend it to observe. Metaphorically, we hold out before us what others have said, and we attempt to do so non-judgmentally. Similarly, we hold out before us our own reactions to others and to what they say. All this is suspended in our view, suspended before us. We are looking at our reactive responses, and these we suspend or pause also. We suspend acting on their impulse. We don't repress them, nor do we express them and indulge them. We simply pause them and observe. Thus, we can see that suspension, in pausing, the scanning and emotional response, fixed action patterns, is pausing control of the verbal logic of the left brain. This opens the door to the right hemisphere's fluid movement and participation in the whole. It makes possible newly discovered scanning, which means that we are seeing anew, and the mind has overwritten old fixed action patterns. As we suspend, as in hold out to view, as we suspend, yes, as in hold out to view, and also, as in pause the response, we're pausing the movement of literal understanding. Thus, we are moving into participatory thought. I do have to skip a little bit. From here on, we're going to follow the pattern of previous sections by closing this one on participatory thought with a wide overarching perspective on where it leads. Thus, we'll look into what it is to explore participatory thought to its end. We'll start our consideration at a point in our inward journey where a shift in inner process and identity has begun. Just to see where this goes. There are different ways to express this shift. So our primary ground of mind has shifted, we could say, from content more to process. That's where our attention is, from literal thought to participatory thought, or from life founded in the particular dimension, all the particular contents of my consciousness, to life more lived as a movement of the general direction. Whichever way we would like to say it, from here we'll move more inward and see where this goes. Just as an overview of this. Beginning at the surface level of life, the particular dimension, I am me and you are you. And our primary relationship is that we are exterior to one another. In the general dimension, however, as experienced from within the implicate order, as Bohm points out, our primary relationship is that we are interior to one another. Here, relationship opens naturally into a sense of non-personal fellowship. David uses the Greek word koinonia, which he describes as meaning non-personal love. When we look at life lived from the general in its open qualities, that is through participatory mind, where our primary relationship is that we are interior to one another, we can see that certain things follow naturally. So then consider the Buddhist four divine abidings, which are heights of Buddhist practice. These are compassion, sympathetic joy, loving kindness, and equanimity. So if we're living at the generic level where our movement is common, then compassion just comes out naturally, as the suffering of others is identified in a sense as our own. Likewise, the happiness, sympathetic joy, loving kindness, and well-being. And then there's equanimity, and this doesn't sound like so much, but this probably is the consummation of all of them. It corresponds to what you might call the Christian idea of the peace that passes all understanding. Anyhow, we can see that these all are simply natural consequences and spontaneous expressions of operating fully through participation, of operating through an identity grounded in the processes, movements of the general dimension of mind where we're one. Finally, when participation is not partial, we're going right to the end, but is entire and complete, then there remains no division of participator from that in which she or he participates. There's only participation. Put another way, the observer-observed duality is no longer. There's only observation. Thus, when participation is full, there's unity. This is life lived from Bohm's universal dimension. An expression of this is given by the sage Nisargadatta, who says, "The heart says that I am everything. The mind says that I'm nothing. And between the two, my life flows." And we could speak a great deal about that also. So here we have a sense of David Bohm's holo movement in its interior human dimension. The Whole of movement, Bohm characterizes as undivided wholeness and flowing movement. Bohm's art form of expression differs from Nisagarata's, who focuses equally on the plenum and the void, but both, each in his own way, draws attention to flowing movement and to wholeness. Okay, few quick points to close this session. Just some brief personal notes about participation, some bullets more or less. Participation is a living thing or movement. It cannot be held in literal thought. Participation is not something I set out to do, but in suspending resistances to view, participation of its own arises. Participation is a movement swifter than literal thought, swifter than our thinking mind. It is beyond the web of literal thought, not capturable. It cannot be controlled. Finally, participation cannot be held. Always it must be rediscovered. So then I have a slide that summarizes, next slide, a few features of participatory and literal thought. And so very quickly then, literal thought. We know our focus is content, what I think, what I feel, my attitudes, my beliefs, my experience. It's what we think. And we learn by accumulation. It's of the past, whacked away in memory, we store it there, and it tends to be about the particular dimension. Participatory thought, our focus is process. It's how we think, it's how we move. We learn non-cumulatively, it's always in the present, movement of perception, and it tends to be about the general dimension. So we have looked now at the vast landscape of the potentials of the participatory understanding. This has taken us far from where most of us live our daily lives. Perhaps this is why Bohm does not give a large emphasis to the vastness he is approaching in his philosophical and dialogical teachings. He works with us where we are. He does touch on what he terms the unlimited, the absolute, the universal, and koinonia, but his focus is on penetration into everyday life and the superficial mind that tends to dominate it. Bohm's challenge to us is to go to the root of what we are. But how in practice do we do this? Again, Bohm has an offering. Again, we will find that whether we explore through dialogue or by contemplations and meditations of our own, participatory understanding remains key. So we're coming to the finale at last, folks. I hope you're not too saddle sore. Let us remind ourselves that free participation is a natural function of the brain. Free participation is a natural function of the brain. It is not a skill to be acquired. Rather, the issue is our mind's resistance to free, undirected, uncontrolled participation. Our fixed action patterns form resistive blocks and rigidities. Those are Bohm's terms. Thus, the issue, in simple words, is just to participate without resistance. When we participate without resistance, the mind of its own unfolds thought. It folds out to sight what has been enfolded and allows it to flower. Here again, we have learning without accumulation. We have learning in which that which the mind incoherently held and implicitly knew, the mind knew things, it knew to behave in certain ways, but they were incoherent. This incoherent process, structure, thought becomes dissolved. And it's dissolved through negative learning, which is unlearning. So we're not accumulating anything. We're definitely not accumulating methods of how to do this. Bohm was so clear on that. There's no method or technique to dialogue. There's no method or technique to this. That's one of the key things to understand if we want to go deeply into it. So when we find an inner resistance to intimate participation in what we are suspending, Bohm points out When we're resisting our process here of suspending, Bohm points out that we do not struggle to overcome resistance. We do not resist the resistance. Rather, we participate in the feeling of resistance itself. In other words, whatever is in the moment, that is what we enter into intimately, in a felt sense. Never do we move away from what we are. So when we're in dialogue, Bohm points out similarly, we do not avoid or suppress what is present. Whatever it is, we go into it. He says, and I quote, people can share their frustration, share their contradictory assumptions, share their mutual anger, and stay with it. He continues, if people could stay with power, violence, and hate all the way to the end, then it would sort of collapse, because ultimately we would see that we are all the same. And I must say, this is the one thing that frustrated me about Bohm. You know, it would sort of collapse because we would see that we were all the same. He so understates, sort of collapse. He's talking about like a complete transformation of a human being. Anyhow, that's the way he said it. So to stay all the way to the end, what does that really mean? It means that we go into the process by living it intimately, and we follow it to its source. And that source for all intimate personal emotions is ultimately the same. It is the self in its fundamental movement. These fundamental processes are common to us all. When our life is felt deeply as a living movement, we find ourselves in and of a process that is common, whatever the particular contents of our consciousness may be. The process, the deep underlying process, is common. In that moment within us, we discover a vital sense of our deep commonality. Here is the experience of Bohm's general or generic dimension. This may not stay with us, but we may have insights into it. Elsewhere, Bohm takes the example of aggression, and he shows how suspension and participation lead to flowering. So flowering means that whatever it is, aggression or whatever, just opens out and shows its whole structure through observation. He says there is another action, this is quoting Bohm, which is neither to carry out aggression nor to turn it against yourself by suppressing it. Rather, we may suspend the activity, allowing it to reveal itself, to flower, to unfold. So you can see the aggression and its actual structure inside you. He goes on to emphasize the importance of being aware of the entirety of thoughts, feelings, and physical sensation in order to sense the broad picture. And I'll just finish up now. I'd like to offer an example of my own, which I hope might help bring out a sense of going to the root by following an exploration in more stepwise detail. Next slide, please. So I'm angry about something. Maybe somebody insulted me, maybe, they did something in a way which I felt is inappropriate or whatever. I am angry about X. Now, if we want to go into this deeply, how are we going to do it? Well, I've been angry lots of times before about lots of other things. And so really the issue is the anger program, and what will set it going. It's not about the particular object of my anger at the moment or any other time. If I'm going to understand this, I have to enter into the program itself. So, okay, I'm angry about X, but now I have to move. Next slide, please. So I've negated the object. It's not really about X. I'm angry, there's the whole process. Now, this is subtler, and I don't know if we can really go into it now, but it's not really about the subject either. It's not about me. if we look at how we learn to apply anger, we do it by mimicry. And the way, we learn it as little kids. And so this whole process of applying the program of anger, and when we apply it and all the rest of that, this is all learned. This is all learned through mimicry. And then we all do this in society, and we feed this process. We keep it going. So if we can understand that even a little bit, then we can say, well, maybe it's not really about me. Other people are angry too, and I understand anger through seeing their anger just as much. So let's negate the subject. Next slide. So anger is, okay, now we're into this in a really participatory state. We're moving with this. This is not just logic, but we're feeling our way into this. We're finding this by feeling our way into it, by being present to it. We're not reasoning here. We're using the Einstein approach. We're feeling it. We're in an embodied way. We're intimate with it. Well, okay, there's this thing called anger. It's a sort of a state of mind. But really, if I feel it carefully, by participating in its movement, it's not a state. It's not static. It's actually a movement. It's a flow. It's not something fixed. So if I participate in it fully, I begin to feel that. And I realize it's a movement. So next slide. Here's another shift. I'm negating negating anger as a content, as a thing. No, it's a movement. It's a living, ongoing movement. Now, if I can stay in that movement and of it, swim in the sea participatorily, I can sense there's something behind it. This movement has a cause. It's not just something that came up. There's something behind it. There's something out of which it's arising. And so I negate its continuity. I say, I'm sensing an arising. So anger is an arising. Next slide. I've negated its continuity. Well, now I'm in a really extraordinary place. If I felt my way into this, it's an arising, it's emergent, and it has a source. And just a side note here, the Dalai Lama was once asked, do you ever get angry? And he said, I see anger arising. You see, if it's met at this level, then there's something entirely different going on. And I want to look, well, okay, I won't do that. I'll just, so anger is an arising. As I become intimate with that, feel my way into that, I can start to feel what it's arising out of. Next slide. So the exploration begins to go into its source. And here, anger may just flower, it may disappear, may see that it's not necessary, or it may move deeper. And everything that I've laid out here, it doesn't have to go this way. There are so many ways it can go, but this is just to give an example. So the question is, where am I now? The question is, who is the journeyer now, and where is the journeyer that started? I started this journey as a subject in anger toward the object. That personal journey, in this moment at least, is no longer. There's a sense here of a global human being flowing inside and outside of oneself and others together in an unfolding truth. So this is my understanding of where Bohm's participatory understanding leads us. In deep participation, we see what has happened is we usually think of the journey as a journey into something, and I'm going to find something there. What has happened is, in this kind of journey, the journeyer has unraveled. The journey who started is no more. And there's a whole different orientation and process of mind which can now enter into these things and explore at an entirely new level. So this, I believe, is the journey that Bohm is leading us into now. And I'm going to conclude with a really brief example of participation. This has led us into the general dimension. And now I'd like to, yes, my watch is hidden here. It's telling me bad things. We've gone as far as the general dimension. And we'll very quickly conclude now with a really brief example of participation, one which blossoms or flowers all the way into the universal dimension. Here, participation goes beyond the root of the psychological movement. We're going to look at fear in its psychological dimension. For example, as a personal anxiety. We're not looking at fear as the practical response of physical fear, where we jump out of the way of an oncoming bus, which response is intelligence. So, last slide. So, I don't think I have to go through this now. You see, we're going to negate the objects first of all. Yes, I'm afraid of something, darkness, but it's not really about the object. It's about the program of being afraid and applying it to something. Then I'm afraid, well, if I can go this far with it and understand fear in a universal sense that belongs to us all, I can negate the subject. Fear is. And if I can stay with this, just stay with it, with the medium of fear and participate in its movement, having lost a subject, lost an object, where am I? I'm just pure awareness. There's no subject, there's no object, there's just awareness in empty purity. So this then is Bohm's universal dimension. Well, oh my dear. Okay, so we've now briefly surveyed participatory thought and what it is to follow thought to its root. We see that this involves great subtlety. However, participation itself is simple and direct. And I would like to close leaving us with a feeling for that participation in itself is simple and direct. What we'll do now is step away from participatory exploration of the mind and do an exercise in participation in the sensations of the body. These are parallel processes in participation, attending to the body and attending to the mind. Through this exercise in participation in sensations in the body, we may come to an easy sense of the nature of participation in general. And now we will follow Caroline as she leads us through a brief exercise.
I just want to be clear that we're okay with this. It's an 8-minute exercise, and after that, if people want to go longer with questions, I guess we can do that, right, Julie?
Absolutely. Take your time.
Okay.
Time.
So hello, everyone. So far, we have been giving attention to thought and to our minds. I would like us to shift from that and do something different for the next few minutes. What I would like us to do is to bring out a feeling for the same process, a process of participation, and we will do this through observation of the body rather than observation of the mind. Now, first, let us be sure that we are sitting comfortably with our feet flat on the floor. And let us allow our eyelids to slowly close. Now that we are comfortable and quiet, we'll take a few lung-filling breaths, breathing easily. As we breathe easily and comfortably, we'll continue sitting quietly, not moving, and with our eyes still closed, we will begin an exercise together in awareness of the body. Now, while we do the exercise, we will not move the body, we will just watch it. As we continue to sit quietly, we'll imagine a string attached to the crown of our head, pulling upward. We are in no way moving or adjusting our body. The string attached to the crown of our head is pulling the neck up nice and straight, pulling on the spine, pulling on the whole spinal column upright. While the string pulls and supports us, we'll feel the small muscles of the neck at the back of the skull. Feel into these muscles, noticing any tension. We just watch, not in any way adjusting, doing nothing about what we observe. Also, we notice that as the body discovers its tensions, these begin to relax. And as tensions relax, each in-breath slightly shifts the body. This happens of its own, without any effort on our part. As the string pulls our crown upward, we feel or sense into the back of the whole neck, aware of any sensation of tension, of blood flowing, anything at all. We just observe. And now the muscles on the sides of the neck. We feel into these. We feel all the sensations and tensions. Next, notice the broad shoulder muscles that support the neck. Feel into them. Feel across their width. Then the muscles of the upper back behind the rib cage. Breathing easily, we attend to these. Finally, we feel deeply into the lower back, all the way down to the coccyx, the tailbone, then into the buttocks that support us. Meanwhile, the string continues to pull upward, but we do nothing. We just observe. Now, once again, we'll briefly scan the whole back. Each of us will scan on our own, the muscles in our neck, shoulders, and back, right down to the buttocks. We'll take a moment to do this. Now, let us slowly open our eyes. If we have participated deeply in intimate observation of the body, then we have seen that through aware participation, the body pulls up and straightens itself without our assistance or action. When the body observes its resistances to coherent order and the free flow of energy within itself, it naturally releases these resistances. It has unlearned these. We could say the body knew to hold certain tensions and rigidities. It no longer knows something that it knew before. This is learning without accumulation. It is the unraveling of a context or framework. All this applies to mind equally. The framework of thought likewise holds resistances and tensions. These, when observed, dissolve, not through us working at them to resolve them, but on their own. This happens without effort. It unravels an implicitly held framework. In this way, inward blocks and resistances to the free flow of energy dissolve. This is the process of David Bohm's participatory understanding. Thank you for sharing in this brief exploration with me. Back to David.
Well, we did finish by the hour, but we didn't leave a lot of space for questions. I'm afraid we're squeezing out the participants, which is terrible.
It's totally fine, David. Thank you. And thank you, Caroline, as well, for your meditation. And I think we kind of collectively agreed to go over time for a while. And so, David and Caroline, if you are okay with that, then we're going to take some space for questions and reflections and insights based also on your own experience of listening to Dave or the exercise. But I would personally suggest that we take a 2-minute mark, like a 2-minute break, whether it's to take a glass of water, bathroom break, just look out of the window, do a stretch, but 2 minutes of silence. And then we'll come back together and we'll open the space for reflections and questions. So enjoy 2 minutes. Something.
Thank you. Thank you. Perfect.
Move and breathe.
You want to come in?
Julie?
Yes?
I have a question. How come I see myself on my screen? Have I shared my screen without knowing?
No, I think you are, just put it on gallery view on the top right corner. Then it should switch to the mosaic again.
Oh.
Well, I just want to say,
2 minutes of silence together, and then
Okay,
we'll go
sorry.
into conversation. Okay, so that was around 2 minutes. So find your way back to this virtual circle. And yeah, we have around, let's say, 20 minutes to share in circle some reflections, insights, experiences, questions. And as this is still a big group, I propose we use the digital hand. So if you click on participants, you can do raise hand digitally, or you write it into the chat and I'll try to catch it there. And then we just go through the process of whoever wants to come in. So if you want to come in, share any reflection or question, please click on participants and click raise hand or write it into the chat. Ellen, please come in.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Well, thank you. That was so rich and deep, and I could also have listened to it for a very long time. I wanted to make two comments. One was that Jung, in his study of the individuation process, that kind of lifelong journey of bringing the ego into relationship with this larger self, he made the comment that individuation does not separate oneself from the world, but draws the world into oneself. And it felt like that had a resonance to me of that merging with the other and finding that we are within this whole. The other, which I don't know if there's time to go into here, but I've been a student of perception and the study of perception for many years. And there's an aspect of perception that I think really is interesting in regards to this notion of participatory thought, which is that, and certainly to questions of mind matter, that there, in perception itself, there is an abstracting activity of the brain. The brain organizes automatically out of awareness. It grasps patterns and organizations. And we are completely unaware of this, but it is what we perceive is nothing really like what our sense organs record. So there is, and what it perceives are abstract patterns actually that are transposable. So for example, music, we perceive melody, not individual notes or qualities of experience. Hardness, it's interaction between a surface that resists penetration or a question that's hard or a person who's unforgiving or whatever. So the reason I bring this up is the Gestalt psychologists did a lot of interesting work with this direct perception of structures and the feeling they can contain. And they suggested that this was a possible connection with higher thought in a way that was not perhaps the division of literal thought and flowing perception. I'm not sure if any of that makes any sense, but I don't want to take any more time. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Would you like to respond to that? You're still muted, Dave.
Yes. No, I think that statement was really complete in itself. And I mean, I've done some studies of perception of my own, but it's a very, very long story. And there's not really time, I'm afraid, it would be good, but not just now. Yes.
Okay.
And thank you for your.
Yeah, during the presentation, I also had the thought, like, what if we could spend a week on this? Then we could cover a lot of these topics. Yeah. Let's move to Gary Goldberg.
So much to comment here. I mean, I have made some contributions to the chat, but I wanted to point out the fundamental paradox that humans' existence entails, which is that we are simultaneously, and this comes out in the phenomenological work of Merleau-Ponty, we are simultaneously subjects and objects. That is, we are simultaneously sensing beings and beings that are sensed. And what that means is that, we are, and this comes out in Bohr's work as well. I mean, it's the basis of the principle of complementarity, that we are both actors, participants, and spectators, observers of our reality. And as a result, I mean, as as spectators, though, we can only deal with closed systems, right? I mean, I think that comes out of the consideration of what versus how. Whereas as active players, we're engaging in an open system. And we know from Gödel that, you know, open systems and closed systems are not equivalent. And in fact, you know, we live in the context of an open physical system, which then prioritizes, I think, you know, the implicative order over the explicative. It's more broad and more expansive, and we just kind of narrow it down for ourselves so that we can deal with it rationally. And I'm wondering what, you know, what you might think of that, David. I mean, the idea that in participatory thought, in process, in action, we have the capability of accessing the novel and the open. Whereas in content and literal thought, we are limited to the closed, and in effect, nothing new that can come about as a result of that.
Well, I would suggest that they're both going on simultaneously all the time, right? You know, these literal processes, conceptual processes, and participatory processes. And perhaps it's more an issue of what is predominating. You know, the corpus callosum has like, 200 million axonal nerves or something. You know, the sides have lots of communication capability. And so I guess perhaps what we're looking at is where the priority and the energy goes. You see, I mean, my default programs being cultured in this society are them to go into literal thought, into, you know, ideas, concepts, my feelings, so on. And if there can be a shift toward the other, then the two can work in harmony. And I think maybe that's possibly what you're saying. In other words, is where we might move.
Well, I think we're too far left hemispheric in the Western world, as Ian Gilchrist has pointed out. And we need to move back more toward the right hemispheric side of things, I think, if we're going to survive. I think most of our problems are due to us getting too far over to the left. But that's up for I
would say that's well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. So we'll go briefly to Eddie and then to Tom Small. So let's start with Eddie.
Great. I'll be brief. Caroline, that was a wonderful presentation, and Davis wasn't too bad either. Actually, quite honestly, David, that was a wonderful presentation. I was glad you mentioned that the importance of not making a program of things. And I'd be just wondering, that obviously down through history, there's creative people pop up, and then there's this incredible tendency to make a program of what they are saying or proposing. And in the situation, I think predisposition can occur with what David talks about with regard to dialogue. So I'm just curious, would you have any sense on what drives this tendency unwittingly in us to make a program?
Yes, because forming fixed action patterns has been necessary to our survival, you know, to doing things efficiently and effectively and automatically. You know, if some creature leaps out of the bushes at me as a primitive man, you know, I'm not going to do well if I have to figure out a lot. So I think it's very much inbuilt. And in terms of David Bohm talking about no methods. I think since we've mentioned dialogue, I think we should be clear that he talked about what he called limited dialogue, which he felt was very important. And this is about methods and so on. Limited dialogue, you know, working within smaller contexts and organizations and so on. But then his main program was something that cannot be defined in that way. He said that he was basically giving us some starting ideas. And this is the program that really has to do with the transformation of individual and global human consciousness. So it's definitely subtler than a program. And it has to do partly with discovery on our own of inner scanning methods so that we may see differently, so that we may see anew. So, thank you, Eddie.
Thank you very much. Especially what you said at the start about a program, you triggered a new meaning for me, that programs also are important.
Yes.
For survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eddie. Tom, I saw your hand up. Tom Small?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, David. Very illuminating what you've presented to us. I want to push it a little bit farther. It just seems to me that so far what we've been talking about has been pretty anthropocentric. And I want to begin from Einstein and that notion that we honor the servant, but we have forgotten or neglected the gift. And indigenous peoples tend to speak a lot about the gift and gratitude for the gift. And in so doing, they raise into consciousness all those other consciousnesses in the animal world and the plant world that in our anthropocentricity, we tend to regard as other rather than as participatory with us and offering us the gift of their consciousness and their awareness and their being on which we depend and in which we participate and of which we partake. And awareness of that gift and of that universality of the dimension that supports us and informs us and unfolds within us all is, to me, in a sense, going back to what indigenous peoples now more and more are talking about as the original instructions, the original awareness, if you will, of the other and the gift and the universal underlying everything as part of an intelligence and a consciousness that unfolds and enfolds.
Well, thank you. Let me just jump to a title of a book that David Bohm wrote. It's Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And what we've gone into is the implicate order, which is one way to approach this whole issue. Another way to approach it is through beginning from wholeness. You see, we would go from, in this approach, from the implicate order to wholeness. Bohm in dialogue tends perhaps more to go from wholeness to the implicate order. And so what you're speaking of Tom, is an approach which is primarily grounded in wholeness, and which will, you see, I don't think that you can go fully into wholeness without the implicate order opening. And I don't think you can go fully into the implicate without it blossoming into wholeness. And so there are possibly many, many ways into this, but at least those are two of the main ones, you know, through wholeness and through the implicate order. And so, yeah, I thank you for bringing that to our attention now.
Really interesting what's happening here. And Dave and Caroline, it's good that you also get to read the chat after this call, because there's some beautiful comments and compliments for both of you in the chat. So we'll make sure you get that afterwards. I think we have time for one more, because I have a lot of announcements on behalf of the Pari Center, but who has another question of reflection, knowing that we could go on forever, but. So I see Katrina. Come in, Katrina.
Hi there. It's more of a comment, and if you have an idea about it, when you talked about the iceberg, and that the iceberg was connected beneath, that really blew my mind, because we often have this idea of a personal journey of unfoldment and learning and integration and all that. And the idea that it's actually the collective that I'm unfolding, it sort of becomes this infinite journey. Like we have this idea that at some point I will become whole and I will be done. And then all of a sudden the idea that it's actually the collective unconscious that we are constantly working on, unfolding and unfolding. I just thank you for that. It's just, I don't know if I have a question as much as I'm just, so thank you for that.
Well, let me comment on your comment, and that is the particular dimension, the general dimension, and the universal dimension are not different places. They are all co-present now. And it's just a question of the opening of doors. You see, we're not finding out anything that we aren't already, in a sense. No, and it's not really about finding out. Yes, there's a bit of that, a bit of knowledge involved, but as Eckhart Tolle says, you know, what you need to know is very little in this journey. It's and so it's really about unfolding what is. All of this is co-present. And so it maybe gives a slightly different perspective on the journey then. And this is, you know, this is in this understanding.
Thank you.
I saw Root Small. Same room.
Okay, thank you. My area of study has been basically Indian philosophy, whether it's Buddhist or whether it's Vedantic philosophy. And I see so many parallels, and I see, you know, what David Bohm has been talking about relative to his dialogues with Krishnamurti, because he comes from that kind of Vedantic, you know, Buddhist philosophy background that merged sort of together in the Himalayan and northern regions of India. And one of the paradigm that it really breaks down into is what they call triputi or tripart, where you have, you know, the subject and the object, and then you have the interaction between the two. You need threeness for that, which is essentially what we were talking about. The paradigm evolves from the unknowable into this kind of magical Maya, you can say, that's what they call it, the illusion of how things appear, becomes two-ness, and out of two-ness becomes threeness, and then becomes five-ness and the multiple and everything. So the paradigm itself is really worth studying because it explains everything. If you read anything in Vedantic or Buddhist philosophy, you see this unfolding, you'll see the parallels between them, and you'll see how there's experience and experiencing and experiencer are all part of this intricate model. And I find it really fascinating to find that expressed in modern science and in physics and so forth, because it's as old as philosophy, and it's as modern as science is today. And we're just simply rediscovering some truths that have been known and put in a different language and from a different time. Thank you.
Well, yes, as you said, or maybe I won't say it correctly, but the experiencer and the experiencer are the same. And it's participatory mind that allows us to step away from the subject-object split. Our literal rational mind can never do that. It doesn't work that way. And when we find, and I find only occasionally, the possibility of moving that way, then there is no observer and observed. There is no participator in that in which they're participating. And so I think these things that David Bohm is pointing out, I mean, they're just facts. He's using his own art form. Vedantic scholars, Buddhist scholars, Eckhart Tolle, people are just pointing these things out or pointing an approach to them in different ways. But if we're not actually talking about facts here, about what really is, then we're just spinning webs. And so, yes. So what you're saying comes from various traditions, and I think there are many ways to look into these matters. And David Bohm is one offering that maybe I know a little bit about, and thought I'd bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for your questions and reflections. And as we said, maybe we need to plant the seed and intention to one day be able to dive into this with Dave in Pari for a couple of days, a bit longer anyway, because I think we only got a fraction of what you actually have to share about these topics, Dave. But thank you so much. And if that's okay, I will close this part of the session now and then do a couple of announcements. But is David and Caroline, do you have some closing words from your side before we do it? No?
Well, only that I really appreciate the participation of everyone in this, and that yeah, I think what David Bohm is simply pointing to is a journey we're all on, and it's just a matter of what we become attentive to, what we discover. And there are many ways to do this, not just Bohmian dialogue or Buddhist meditation, many ways. And, any of them can be wonderful. So thank you so much for your participation in this.
Thank you.
And thank you, Caroline.
Thank you,
Yes,
Caroline.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So, yeah, thank you both for being here and offering your wisdom, experience, and intelligence. It's wonderful. Tomorrow, we have the next session with Jan, who's been with us, actually, in this call and in many other calls. And Jan will speak about the future of physics, non-locality, interconnectedness, and the quantum observer. So I'm sure it's going to be an amazing session as well. Jan, you want to say a sentence or two about it?
Well, just I really look forward to spending some time with you tomorrow. You don't know me, most of you probably don't know me, but I've been influenced by David Bohm for more than 30 years. And what I'm going to do tomorrow is really return to the science and to look at the future of science, what it might hold if, in fact, interconnectedness is fundamental. And that, of course, is not considered by science today. And so I'm going to look at non-locality through the lens of 21st century science. How does David Bohm's thinking connect to science in 2020? What is the mainstream's view on David Bohm's concepts of non-locality and his quantum theory. In the first part of my session, so I'd like to spend half an hour on that, and then maybe you jump in, we take a break. And then I want to spend in the second part of the talk on the philosophy more, on connecting, enfolding, unfolding, the sort of topic that David has talked about on implicate order, and how that connects to thinking in emergence theory, in complexity theory, in systems theory, which has very similar concepts based on process science. And I want to connect those two worlds because they have not really communicated. And so that will be the second part. And so in a nutshell, it will be about connecting David Bohm's thinking to mainstream science and where that connection stands today. And I think that's a very fitting sort of completion of the summer school to return to that, because we spent a decade of work on this, on promoting David Bohm's views in the mainstream. I'm going to update you on progress in that tomorrow. So I look forward to that.
Thank you very much.
Sounds super interesting. So it is, these today and tomorrow are the last sessions, as you said, about the online series, which has been this 14-week journey that we've been on. And we had no idea whether it was all going to be people joining one session, but many of you have been on this journey for 2 months. And so tomorrow is Jan, and then you will have seen that there is on September 6th that we added a session based on the request of several people, and also that Macy offered to organize and co-host a session with several of the panelists about the future. And Jan, you already talked about it a little bit, but there is something about looking at his work, and then there's something about how this is even more relevant than ever. At where we are in the world in this moment, and what does that look like? What does that mean? Like, how can this be of service of humanity and each of us even more? And so it would be fantastic if you can make it. It's September 6th, that's the Sunday, and the confirmed panelists are Leroy, Little Bear, Lee Nickel, Shantena Sabatini, David Schrum, Chris Dooney, and Beth Macy, both as panelist and facilitator. And we've seen that many of you have found a way to Sutra, and it's really, it's good to see how conversation is continuing. And so even though the last session is tomorrow and then September 60 officially, we hope that this stays a place for you to continue to connect and that things emerge there, right? The future is emerging in Sutra as we think. So continue to use it as it helps you. And if you have any questions, then you can always, and I'm going to post them in the chat, if you have any questions about anything, you can reach out to or Dave or James or Eleanor, whether it's practical, content-wise, or anything. So thank you for stretching and expanding your attention for another 30 minutes and being here, staying with this session. Thank you, Dave and Caroline. And see you tomorrow or on September 6th.
Thank you, David and Caroline.
Bye.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
David.
Caroline. It's great to see you. It really is. Thank you very, very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.